fellow citizens tonight, whomever they may be, is.
That is where we leave our American coverage of the terrorist attack. For the latest from Sky News. Terrorist strike, key American sites the targets of hijacked planes. As thousands perish, Saudi millionaire under suspicion. On alert, Australia imposes a tight security cordon. And one other big story today, Air New Zealand to liquidate Ansett after Qantas says no to buying it.
Sky News, on the hour, with Susanne Latimore.
It is being labelled the worst terrorist attack ever. Tens of thousands of people are feared dead after 4 planes were hijacked, 2 crashing into New York's famous World Trade Center, 1 ploughing into the Pentagon in Washington, and a 4th crashing in Pennsylvania. Let's take a look now at the latest major developments. Emergency services are working into the night to rescue any survivors and retrieve the bodies of the dead. The death toll has been estimated in the tens of thousands, including at least 7 Australians and 300 firefighters. US military forces worldwide are on high alert. New York mayor warns against vengeance attacks. And world leaders are continuing to condemn the attack on the US.
8:48 a.m. Mayhem in Manhattan.
We saw a plane coming very low, and everyone said, wow, that plane is very, very low.
Come on, guys. Building number 7 would indeed fall down.
The Pentagon, the heart of US defence operations, is still smouldering after the aircraft attack which left it in ruins. The US government is vowing military retaliation on whoever is responsible.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
Clip this ball over here, hit another ball and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody.
The FBI is already combing the debris for clues to who was behind this.
Australia has mounted a massive security operation around the United States, Israeli and other embassies and consulates as the world goes on to high alert against any possible further attacks. All aircraft flights to and from the United States have been suspended. 7 Australians based in New York are among those who died when the hijacked aircraft crashed. In Washington, Prime Minister John Howard has assured the United States that Australia will stand behind it even if lethal action is taken against the terrorists.
An obviously overwhelmed Prime Minister has immediately offered Australian support to the United States for any retaliatory action it takes against whoever is responsible for the attack.
We will stand by them, we will help them, we will support actions they take to properly retaliate in relation to these acts of bastardry against their citizens and against what they stand for.
Mr. Howard says the attacks have affected him deeply.
My personal thoughts and prayers are very much with those left bereaved by these despicable attacks upon the American people and the American nation.
A sentiment echoed throughout the government and the opposition.
I just watched it unfold over the next couple of hours in a state of complete horror.
Decent, open, democratic societies like ours are enormously vulnerable. And in a sense, we will always stay that way. Why? Because we are decent, open and democratic societies.
This is an appalling act, quite appalling, and so cold, so premeditated, so meticulously planned, so evil in its intent that it beggars description.
Federal police in Canberra have thrown a cordon around the US Embassy and other American and foreign establishments across the nation.
Heightened security has been established for United States consulates in Sydney and Melbourne and Perth. There's been additional close personal security provided for the American Chargé.
Qantas and Air New Zealand have suspended all flights into and out of the United States in line with a US order grounding all aircraft movements. In Brisbane, a United Airlines jumbo has been cleared after a security scare apparently sparked by a passenger using a computer game. Meanwhile, in New York, Austrade says its 11 staff members have all been accounted for. Terry Galloway, Sky News.
Sky News political editor David Speers joins me now from Canberra. Well, David, what's been the outcome of the emergency cabinet meeting there today?
Well, the acting Prime Minister John Howard convened the National Security Committee meeting this morning. It was basically a phone hookup of senior ministers who are dispersed around the country at the moment. They were briefed by defence chiefs on any plans needed to counter any terrorism acts here in Australia, although the government insists it has no indication that that is likely, but is taking all precautions necessary. And certainly security has been heightened here in Canberra. As we've heard, there are roadblocks around the US Embassy. It's been locked down. The Israeli Embassy also has heightened security, and government buildings here in Canberra. It is a little quiet here in Canberra at the moment, but still that security is quite visible. Here at Parliament House, everybody entering the building, even staff members, are still being screened, x-rayed for their personal belongings.
We are without our leader. Any word on when John Howard will return to Australia?
Well, it now looks likely that John Howard may remain in the United States for at least another couple of days. The big reason for that, of course, is that all aircraft movement has been grounded in the United States until noon tomorrow, US time. So certainly for John Howard, who flew into Washington on a commercial flight, he cannot fly out on one at the moment. Now, the government says contingency plans are being prepared, but they won't elaborate on those. So it could be he'll be flown out on a special Air Force flight in the next couple of days. But for now, he has to stay put. He's been put up at the Australian ambassador's residence in Washington, a secure location.
David, the finger of blame is being pointed so far at Osama bin Laden, but the Australian government urging us not to jump to conclusions.
Yes, that's right. The Immigration Minister, Philip Ruddock, has urged Australians not to jump to conclusions as to who may be responsible for this terrorist attack. Certainly the talkback radio is going crazy with people pointing the finger of blame not only at Osama bin Laden but also at the Islamic people in general. And certainly there seems to be a fair degree of hostility towards the Middle Eastern countries that is emerging in the feedback from the community. So the government is urging Australians to be calm. So have a number of church leaders and the Governor-General as well. Now, the Governor-General is expected to attend a church service here in Canberra this afternoon. It will basically be a non-denominational prayer service for the victims in the United States.
And David, what about the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting? Has the government made a decision on whether or not it will still go ahead?
Yes, the government says it will go ahead, and certainly the Queensland Premier Peter Beattie has asked the federal government to ensure that it does, and the word from the federal government is that it will. It doesn't want to send a message that it is willing to cancel this sort of a meeting just because of the terrorist attacks we've had in the United States. That, they believe, would send the wrong message. But certainly there will be heightened fears that the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting to be held next month in Brisbane could provide the opportunity for a similar terrorist attack, with so many foreign heads of state in the one place at the one time. Security will be reviewed for the Commonwealth leaders meeting, but it will still go ahead.
David Speers, thank you very much.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Well, of course, we'll have the very latest on the US terrorist attacks later in the bulletin, but first, the other major story of the day. Air New Zealand has proposed that Ansett be liquidated and reformed as a new value-based airline. The Kiwi carrier has asked the Australian government to underwrite Ansett temporarily to allow it to keep the carrier flying. Joining me now with that story in the studio is Business Daily's Andrew Robertson.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, Ansett's hopes of survival have been dealt a major blow, with Qantas ruling out any takeover of the troubled airline. Ansett's parent company, Air New Zealand, is now calling on the Australian government to underwrite the carrier to keep it operating while it's liquidated.
It was an opportunity for Qantas to rule the skies, but the flying kangaroo has said no to a takeover of its stricken rival Ansett. After closely examining the state of Ansett's books, Qantas says it simply can't afford to take on the financial burden. With the Qantas takeover rejected, Ansett's dim hopes of survival have been sent into a nosedive. Singapore Airlines has already ruled out stepping in to rescue the company. Australia's only other carrier, cut-price airline Virgin Blue, has only ever offered to pick up a handful of Ansett's assets. Liquidation of the crippled airline now appears certain. In a last-ditch plea, Ansett's parent company Air New Zealand has asked the Howard government to temporarily underwrite the carrier to keep it in the air. Under the plan, Ansett would be liquidated and reformed as a new discount airline referred to on paper as Ansett 2. But the government has made clear it does not favour a taxpayer-funded bailout. There are now grave fears for Ansett's 16,000 workers, with a further 45,000 jobs in the related tourism and hospitality industries also under threat. The airline's regional services could also disappear, delivering a major political blow to the government on the eve of an election. Ansett's bleak future will be made clearer tomorrow when Air New Zealand delivers its annual result. David Speers, Sky News, Canberra.
Well, joining me now is Heather Jeffrey, the head of Ansett Air New Zealand Public Relations. And Heather, is the game finally up for Ansett?
Not yet. We're out, but we're down, but we're not out, I should say.
Have you had any response from Canberra, any sort of timetable as to when they'll give you a definite answer on your request to underwrite a new Ansett?
As a matter of fact, while you had me on hold, we've just received an initial response. We've just been advised that the Australian government does not favour this proposal. Our proposal for Ansett 2, which would be a value-based airline for Australia with a similar cost base to Virgin Blue, but with a much broader network coverage nationally, regionally across Australia. And I'm just receiving advice while we're talking that the government does not favour the proposal, and we're now discussing with them a further option which has become available during the day. We've received expressions of interest in Ansett from other potential purchasers, and we're now seeking Australian government underwriting to pursue those prospects with urgency.
Can you tell us which airlines they are?
I'm unable to confirm that, nor whether they're in fact airlines, but the situation is obviously changing very rapidly, and we'll be making some further announcements as soon as we have a development to report.
But if you don't get positive responses to anything, then Ansett's hours even are up very quickly, aren't they?
Tomorrow is our scheduled end-of-year result meeting. I'm not willing to comment at all on any time frame. I'm sure that while the aviation industry around the world puts this well and truly into perspective, it's a very worrying time for our staff, and we are pulling out all stops to find a solution. Our board is working on that now.
A very worrying time for staff with good reason, because whatever happens, lots of them are going to lose their jobs.
We will wait and see. At this stage, we have several proposals. We need the Australian government support to continue those proposals and to take us forward, perhaps in a different form. Our board is working on this right away.
Heather Jeffrey, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, listening to that in our Sydney studio is aviation analyst Peter Harbison. And Peter, what do you make of the current situation?
Well, obviously changing from minute to minute, and Heather's announcement there obviously wasn't particularly good news for many of us. I must say personally rather hoping that the Australian government would, under the right conditions, intervene just to keep the airline alive temporarily, because maybe the best of outcomes, given that it's a very bad outcome whatever, would have been to have the airline alive with the potential for future growth. To have it liquidated would, I think, not serve anybody's interest well.
How long has Ansett got if nothing changes?
Tomorrow certainly looks like the day.
Were you surprised that Qantas didn't make a takeover bid?
Not in the least. I would have, on the other hand, been totally astonished if they had. Both they and Singapore Airlines, and they must obviously themselves be very much aware of this, are listed companies, and the impact of taking on something like this, which is quite clearly losing money and is not totally complementary to Qantas's activities, would probably have hit their share price quite savagely, and the future, in the near future, would have been very, very difficult.
Now, what about this proposal for an Ansett to a supposed value airline? What do you make of that?
Well, I find that a relatively positive outcome, as I was saying before, in terms of actually keeping the airline alive, because if you are able to do that, you not only help get a lot of employees through, plus the industry, plus the travelling public, but you also create a vehicle which can, in the future, be expanded again. And certainly the demand is there for a whole lot more aircraft flying. So it seemed to me, if we can just make that transition one way or another commercially, that's perhaps the best outcome at this late day.
Well, with tomorrow the deadline, you'd be expecting a lot more hectic activity between now and then.
I would think, particularly from what Heather was saying, with potential other interests becoming involved, and presumably because at this stage the price is low, and some pretty savage cuts would be made in terms of aircraft and staff.
I would have thought, politically at least, that the government is over a barrel here and would want to keep Ansett flying at least until after the election.
That's certainly, I think, the main reason in the last couple of months that the government's got involved in these discussions at all. I think if it were not an election year, it would have been a much easier equation for them. That said, it is an issue which obviously goes beyond just a few jobs in an airline. This is something which it would actually show on the GDP figures for the year if Ansett falls over. It's something which really measures big on the Richter scale.
You mentioned jobs there. Whatever happens, though, lots of jobs are going here.
Oh, I think inevitably we're talking thousands of jobs.
Peter Harbison, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, away from Ansett now, and there's been a muted response on financial markets to the crisis in the United States. Wall Street was closed overnight and some Asian markets are closed today. Here are the latest figures. Well, a lot of red ink there, and we'll have more on that throughout the afternoon and on Business Daily tonight. Suzanne?
Thanks very much, Andrew. American intelligence sources say there is emerging persuasive evidence that Saudi-born millionaire Osama bin Laden is behind the terrorism. Communications between alleged members of a terrorist group loyal to him have been intercepted just hours after the attacks.
Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds.
Federal agents are reportedly set to serve search warrants in South Florida in connection with attacks on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon. A local ABC television reports agents will search a home or homes of a passenger or passengers listed on the manifest of one of the hijacked planes. The planned search will focus on Davie, a city about 30 kilometres northwest of Miami. Authorities are warning against racial prejudice as the United States searches for those responsible for the terrorist attacks. There's been an appeal for calm, and the Arab community appears united in its condemnation of the tragedy.
Shocked and full of sorrow, many Arab Americans are also and offering prayers as the Arab American community prepares for the onslaught of accusations.
Once again, let's take a look at the headlines on Sky News Australia. Rescue workers continue to pull survivors from the rubble of New York's World Trade Center after the world's worst ever terrorist attack. 4 planes were hijacked, 2 crashing into the World Trade Center, 1 ploughing into the Pentagon in Washington, and a 4th crashing in Pennsylvania. American intelligence sources say there is emerging persuasive evidence that Saudi-born millionaire Osama bin Laden is behind the terrorism. Communications between alleged members of a terrorist group loyal to him have been intercepted just hours after the attacks. And Australia has mounted a massive security operation around the United States, Israeli and other embassies and consulates as the world goes on to high alert against any further possible attacks. You are watching Sky News, continuing coverage on the terrorist attacks in the United States. Stay with us now as our coverage continues.
Pennsylvania is going to use